This is also a time of change for my family.
King Charles believed the most painful secrets surrounding his mother had already been buried with her. Then a private evidence file was placed before him, containing a chain of correspondence that appeared to connect Queen Camilla to the concealment of Elizabeth II's private will. He read the first page once, then again, and when he finally lowered it, the king did not ask who had leaked it. He asked a far more dangerous question: who had hidden it? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept reading as the room seemed to shrink. The sealed archival review file contained correspondence, access records, and a memorandum missing from the archive log. An archival review is a formal check showing where sensitive papers came from, who handled them, and where they went. In this dramatized account, the discovery was clear. New evidence suggested Camilla had been connected to efforts to keep Elizabeth II's private will from relatives named in its instructions. The document mattered because it concerned property, family duties, personal possessions, and responsibilities the late monarch intended others to carry. Charles reached the memorandum and stopped. He placed both hands flat on the desk, looked at the aide opposite him, and asked whether the material had been authenticated. A documented internal account for the fictional review stated that the records matched the surviving access trail. That answer changed the king's expression. Shock hardened into betrayal, because the question was no longer whether papers had vanished. It was whether someone close to him had helped keep his mother's wishes from those she trusted. Camilla received the warning soon afterward. She did not erupt or demand that the meeting stop. Instead, the queen consort asked one question: who else had seen the file? Her concern sharpened the danger because knowledge was spreading. One entry was especially damaging. It recorded Elizabeth's private instructions being moved outside the normal chain of custody shortly after her death. That phrase meant the expected sequence of people responsible for safeguarding and transferring sensitive papers had been interrupted. Charles turned to the pages and found something worse. The concealed material was not merely sentimental. It contained wishes about inheritances and family responsibilities. Then he saw a name linked to the paper trail that he had never expected to see. The king removed his glasses, set them beside the file, and sat without speaking. Finally, he ordered that Camilla be asked to meet him privately. The evidence stunned the sovereign, but the real damage would begin when the family understood what Elizabeth's hidden instructions could cost them. This was no longer simply a question about a hidden document. It was a collision between a husband and wife, a son and his late mother, and an heir watching the monarchy enter territory where family loyalty could become institutional danger. Charles faced a choice no sovereign wants to make: protect the woman beside him, protect the wishes of the mother whose reign shaped his life, or discover whether those two duties had become impossible to reconcile. Charles felt the weight of that choice before he said a word to anyone. Elizabeth had not been merely the late monarch to him. She had been his mother, the woman whose judgment had shaped his understanding of duty for a lifetime. That made every page personal. The private instructions mattered because they could affect family possessions, responsibilities, and guidance intended for the next generation. They also mattered because any attempt to redirect them would strike directly at the trust holding the family together. William entered the conversation already knowing something was wrong. The Prince of Wales, the heir expected to follow his father to the throne, was especially concerned about anything Elizabeth may have written regarding the future of the monarchy and the younger generation. Charles initially spoke carefully, describing the records without naming Camilla. His son listened in silence, until the implication became impossible to miss. Then he asked the question his father had been avoiding. Did he actually believe the evidence pointed toward her? Charles did not answer quickly. The king pushed part of the file across the table and allowed William to read for himself. Halfway through, the prince stopped. He had discovered a reference to an annex missing from the recovered papers. An annex is simply an additional section attached to a main document, often containing details considered too specific or sensitive for the central text. Here, it appeared to contain Elizabeth's most private directions. William closed the folder halfway and looked directly at his father. Did grandmother know this could happen? Charles remained silent. Camilla waited elsewhere, but she understood what that silence could mean. The Queen Consort learned that husband and son were speaking without her, and the controlled calm she had maintained began to fracture. She asked whether William had been shown the evidence. When the answer came back yes, she knew the crisis had crossed a dangerous line. This was no longer confined to Charles and his private doubts. The future king now knew. William opened the folder again and found the detail that changed the entire timeline. A handwritten routing note indicated that the missing annex had been removed before the other papers entered the expected archival process. This no longer looked like confusion or careless handling. Someone had made a choice. Charles now needed to know when that choice began. And the answer would drag all three of them back to one particular gathering, months before Elizabeth's death, when a seemingly ordinary family conversation quietly became the point of no return. The mystery did not begin after Elizabeth's death. It began earlier, during a private family gathering, when a discussion about papers, possessions, and succession suddenly became far more serious than anyone expected. At the time, the exchange seemed almost routine. Later, every sentence would be reconsidered. Every pause would matter. Because according to the reconstructed timeline, that was the moment Elizabeth made clear that certain instructions were personal, protected, and meant to reach specific members of her family, without interference. Elizabeth had always understood the difference between the duties of the crown and the choices she made as a private individual. Sovereign business meant official matters carried out in her role as monarch, while personal correspondence and private family instructions belonged to her outside that machinery. Charles knew his mother kept some wishes separate from formal royal processes, but he did not know every detail, every recipient, or every condition attached to them. That distinction mattered because it meant the papers were never supposed to become a tool of household influence. Elizabeth made that boundary unmistakable during the Windsor gathering. With Charles and Camilla present, the Queen explained that a sealed set of instructions was to remain untouched until after her death, and then pass through a designated private channel. A private channel simply meant a limited route involving specific trusted people, rather than the broader palace administration. Camilla listened before asking whether those instructions could affect future household arrangements. The monarch answered firmly that the contents were hers to determine. The tone changed immediately. Charles tried to ease the tension after that exchange. He reminded both women that no decision needed to become a source of conflict, but his mother returned to the point with unusual force. Elizabeth repeated that nobody, including immediate family, had authority to redirect those papers once her wishes had been set. Camilla said little after that. The Queen Consort appeared controlled, yet Charles remembered the distance that had suddenly entered the room. Charles would later replay one small moment again and again. After Elizabeth left, he reached for his wife's hand. Camilla pulled her fingers back for only a second, before allowing him to touch them. It was brief, almost meaningless at the time. Now it felt different. The king could no longer separate that reaction from what the recovered evidence suggested had happened afterward. Then the records delivered the darker connection. A documented access log showed that someone linked to Camilla's private office later requested information about where Elizabeth's personal papers were being held. The timing was devastating. The inquiry came shortly after the Windsor conversation. What had once looked like routine administration now appeared to be the first movement in a much larger chain. Charles finally understood where suspicion began. But motive could not be found in a logbook. It had to be heard directly from Camilla, and the conversation waiting behind that closed door would force both of them to confront what neither could now pretend was accidental. There were no advisors between them, no secretaries, no carefully prepared language. When Charles finally faced Camilla, he was not speaking as a sovereign delivering an institutional warning. He was a husband, asking his wife whether she had interfered with the final wishes of his mother. And for the first time since the evidence emerged, Camilla could not answer through distance, protocol, or intermediaries. She had to look directly at the man whose trust was now hanging by a thread. Charles had deliberately kept everyone else outside the conversation. He wanted an answer before palace machinery turned a private betrayal into a formal crisis involving officials, records, and competing households. The king placed only 3 pieces of material before her: the routing memorandum, the access request, and the reconstructed timeline linking Elizabeth's papers to her office. A routing memorandum is simply a written record showing where sensitive material was supposed to go and who was expected to handle it. Here, it mattered because the normal path had been interrupted. Camilla read only part of the material before Charles asked the question directly. Had she known Elizabeth's private instructions were being diverted? The Queen Consort hesitated, then argued that she had been trying to protect the stability of the royal household from directions that might create unnecessary conflict. That word changed everything. Charles seized on protect. His mother's wishes, he said, had never belonged to anyone else to manage, delay, or soften. His anger remained controlled, but the argument had already moved beyond procedure. This was now about loyalty. Camilla finally acknowledged that she knew certain papers had been temporarily withheld. She insisted, through the reconstructed account of their private conversation, that she never intended the material to disappear forever. Her explanation only deepened Charles's suspicion. Temporary concealment still required a decision, and someone had made that decision knowing Elizabeth had specifically warned against interference. The king asked who gave the instruction. She avoided the answer. Charles then produced the strongest page in the file. A recorded message copied into the internal review instructed that the missing annex should remain outside the family distribution packet until the appropriate moment. The distribution packet meant the set of private papers intended to reach specific family members after Elizabeth's death. Camilla pushed the page away. Charles slowly moved it back toward her and asked her to read the sentence aloud. She refused. Camilla understood what that refusal meant. She was no longer defending a vague administrative choice. She was facing evidence of deliberate delay. Charles asked one final question. Who decided when the appropriate moment would arrive? Her answer pointed beyond their marriage, toward a wider circle of influence around the papers. Their marriage had survived years of public judgment, but this crisis was different. Trust had already been damaged. Now Charles had to discover who possessed the power to interfere with Elizabeth's final wishes, and whether that power had ever truly belonged to Camilla alone. The confrontation gave Charles part of the truth, but not control of the situation. Somewhere between Elizabeth's private wishes and the people meant to receive them, a chain of authority had failed, or been manipulated. Now the king had to discover whether Camilla acted alone, whether others enabled the concealment, and who possessed the authority to restore what had been withheld without turning a family crisis into a constitutional spectacle. Charles moved quickly, because delay now carried its own danger. Elizabeth's private family instructions were different from formal constitutional instruments, meaning they concerned personal wishes, possessions, and family responsibilities, rather than changing the legal order of succession or the powers of the crown. That distinction mattered. The monarchy was not facing a succession crisis, but it was facing something painfully intimate: the possibility that a late sovereign's private choices had been deliberately controlled after her death. Charles ordered a restricted review of custodial records, archive movements, correspondence logs, and every person who had handled the packet. A restricted review meant only a small circle could examine the material, reducing the risk of leaks while preserving the chain of evidence. The king wanted facts, not whispers. He also wanted to know whether the message about waiting for the appropriate moment had come from Camilla herself or from someone operating around her. William pressed his father harder than anyone else dared. The prince warned that marital loyalty could not be allowed to weaken the inquiry, because any appearance of protection would damage trust inside the family and beyond it. Charles knew he was right. That made the warning hurt more. His son was not attacking his marriage, he was protecting the principle Elizabeth had tried to preserve. Still, the king could feel three identities colliding inside him at once: husband, son, sovereign. Camilla felt the consequences almost immediately. The queen consort learned that access to the relevant records had been moved outside her normal household circle, leaving her unable to influence who saw what. That decision was quiet, but devastating. She understood that Charles had not stripped her of public standing, yet in this matter, he had removed her from the room. Her authority had narrowed, because his trust had narrowed first. Then the review produced the first major breakthrough. A documented internal account identified a second individual who had helped delay the packet, but the records suggested that person had acted after receiving direction, rather than independently. More importantly, a registry entry revealed something nobody had expected. The missing annex had never been destroyed. It had been transferred into a protected private holding location. Charles signed the retrieval instruction without speaking. The king paused over his signature, finished the order, then pressed the pen firmly onto the desk. William watched him and understood what had changed. They were no longer chasing suspicion. Elizabeth's own words might still be intact. And once that retrieval order was signed, the crisis became far more dangerous, because soon the family would discover exactly what had been hidden from them. When the missing annex was finally recovered, nobody celebrated. The document represented victory only in the narrowest sense. For Charles, it meant confronting words from his mother that he should have received years earlier. For William, it meant discovering whether Elizabeth had anticipated the family tensions now consuming them. And for Camilla, it meant the end of uncertainty. Whatever had been hidden could no longer be controlled, delayed, softened, or explained away. Charles received the recovered pages under tightly controlled conditions and began reading before anyone else was invited in. The annex, meaning the additional section attached to the main private instructions, did not change constitutional succession or alter who would inherit the throne. Its power came from something more intimate. Elizabeth had used it to set out personal wishes, involving private possessions, family responsibilities, and the conduct she expected from those closest to her. That mattered, because the concealment had not threatened law. It had threatened trust. Charles reached one passage and stopped. His mother had written that personal duty must never be placed beneath convenience, household rivalry, or the comfort of those already closest to power. The king read the sentence again, but the second reading hurt more than the first. He folded his hands over the page and looked away. This was no longer evidence speaking to him. It was Elizabeth. William was later invited to hear the portions that affected the family. The prince listened as his father read instructions assigning sentimental objects and specific responsibilities to younger generations. Some wishes touched directly on William and his children, making the delay painfully personal. The future king understood immediately why the papers mattered. These were not decorative gestures. They were Elizabeth's final attempts to shape family bonds after she was gone. William watched his father fall silent and, for a moment, saw a grieving son rather than a sovereign. He quietly turned away and gave him space. Camilla received confirmation that the annex had been recovered soon afterward. The queen consort remained composed until her aide left. Then the meaning of the discovery became impossible to avoid. Everything she had said to Charles about temporary withholding could now be measured against Elizabeth's exact words. There was nowhere left for interpretation to hide. Charles found the most devastating passage near the end. Elizabeth had specifically instructed him to protect family unity by ensuring that no spouse, advisor, or household reshaped her private wishes after her death. The king stopped midway through the line. William did not interrupt him. Charles now faced a choice evidence could not make for him. He could punish Camilla, forgive her, or redefine how close she would ever again be allowed to stand to matters of private trust. Elizabeth's voice had finally returned through the missing pages. But the final judgment belonged to the living man, forced to decide what betrayal meant inside his own marriage. There was no council table when Charles reached his decision. No row of advisors. No palace choreography. Only a private conversation between father and son after the recovered instructions had been read. William did not demand punishment. Charles did not ask permission. Instead, the two men spoke about Elizabeth, trust, and the difference between forgiveness and pretending nothing had happened. By the time the conversation ended, Charles knew exactly what he would do, and exactly what it would cost. Charles chose William because this was bigger than one marriage. The prince was directly affected by Elizabeth's instructions, but he was also the man expected to carry the monarchy into its next chapter. That made his judgment deeply personal and impossible to dismiss. No aides, legal officers, or household representatives were present. This was not an institutional consultation. It was a father asking his son how much damage silence could do when everyone inside the family already knew the truth. William spoke carefully. He told his father that he did not want Camilla publicly humiliated or turned into a spectacle. But he also believed concealment could not simply disappear behind royal discretion. The future king understood that mercy mattered. So did accountability. Charles listened without interruption, because his son had reached the same conclusion he was resisting. Forgiveness could exist, but pretending nothing happened would betray Elizabeth all over again. Charles finally admitted what hurt most. The king said the deepest wound was not only that the papers had been delayed. It was discovering that his mother had anticipated the possibility of interference and had written safeguards against it. Elizabeth had understood the family she was leaving behind. That realization made the monarch feel exposed, in a way no public scandal could match. Then Charles made the decision. Camilla would keep her public dignity and remain beside him in royal life, but the queen consort would lose any private role involving Elizabeth's personal archives, legacy instructions, or the distribution of family papers. Those responsibilities would be handled elsewhere. The line was quiet but permanent. Trust had not vanished completely. It had changed shape. Charles went further. Every instruction affected by the concealment would now be carried out exactly as Elizabeth had written it. The missing wishes would not merely be acknowledged. Their consequences would be reversed. William felt relief, but it was mixed with sympathy. He could see that his father had chosen principle at personal cost. William rose to leave, but Charles asked him to stay another moment. Then the king said something that ended the argument inside himself. Protecting the crown could never mean erasing what happened inside the family. The decision remained private only briefly. Once Elizabeth's wishes began being restored, the outside world would notice the pattern. Charles had drawn his line behind closed doors. But royal consequences rarely stay hidden for long. The palace never needed to publish every detail for the world to understand that something fundamental had changed. The altered responsibilities, the restored family possessions, and Camilla's sudden distance from matters involving Elizabeth's legacy created a pattern too visible to ignore. Then came the public moment that crystallized everything. One morning, Britain woke to a front page dominated not by ceremony or celebration, but by a single question about trust inside the House of Windsor. Charles understood that silence could protect privacy, but it could not erase a pattern everyone had begun to notice. Palace communications stressed that Elizabeth's personal wishes were being respected and carried out without exposing intimate family details. Those communications were official statements used to explain royal decisions without revealing private conversations. Yet, every careful sentence raised another question. Why had certain responsibilities changed? Why were possessions suddenly being restored? And why was Camilla no longer involved in matters connected to the late Queen's private legacy? Camilla continued her public duties, but the Queen consort knew something invisible had shifted around her. She could still stand beside Charles at ceremonies, still perform the responsibilities expected of her, yet matters involving Elizabeth were now handled elsewhere. That boundary carried more pain than any public punishment might have done. The king had preserved her position while quietly limiting his trust, and she understood that the difference would not remain hidden forever. Charles felt the humiliation in another way. The monarch could remain composed before cameras and crowds, but privately he was watching his marriage become part of a story about his mother's final wishes. One morning, he found a fictional newspaper carrying the headline, "The Queen's Last Words. Why were they hidden?" The king read only part of the article, before folding the paper and continuing breakfast in silence. An aide waited nearby for instructions. None came. William watched the public mood deepen. The prince realized that his grandmother's memory had become the moral center of the entire crisis. A broadcaster described the conflict not as a battle over constitutional power, but over whether Elizabeth's personal authority had been respected after death. Constitutional power means the legal authority connected to the monarchy and the state. This dispute was different. It was about whether a mother, grandmother, and sovereign had been allowed to have the final word over her own private wishes. Then the public response became impossible to dismiss. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, carrying flowers for Elizabeth rather than protest signs. The gesture was quiet, but its message was sharp. People were not demanding spectacle. They were expressing loyalty to the late Queen and sorrow that her wishes had become the center of conflict. Charles could feel public judgment closing in. Camilla could feel isolation hardening around her. William could see that reputation would not be repaired simply because the documents had been recovered. The world had already delivered its emotional verdict loudly. Now Charles had to deliver his own, and his final decision would be quieter, colder, and far more permanent. In the end, Charles did not destroy his marriage, and he did not erase the betrayal. He chose a harder path. Camilla would remain his wife and continue to stand beside him in public life, but the trust surrounding Elizabeth's private legacy would never be restored to what it had been. Every concealed instruction was implemented. Every affected family member received what the late Queen intended, and the king made certain that nobody inside the palace could ever again decide that Elizabeth's final wishes were inconvenient. Charles formally closed the internal review only after the recovered material had been restored, and every relevant instruction had been acted upon. An internal review is a private examination carried out within the royal household to determine what happened, who handled sensitive material, and what corrective action should follow. The king knew closure mattered, because allowing the dispute to linger would keep Elizabeth's memory trapped inside a scandal. It also mattered because the family needed certainty. Her final wishes had to become actions, not arguments. William accepted the outcome because the central principle had survived. The prince did not need to see Camilla publicly destroyed to believe accountability had been achieved. Elizabeth's instructions had been honored, the affected possessions had reached their intended recipients, and the responsibilities she assigned were finally being carried out. For the future king, that was the real victory. He had watched his father suffer, but he had also watched him choose duty over denial. Charles then faced Camilla one final time in private. The king told her that forgiveness was possible, But forgetting would dishonor both what his mother had written and what he had learned from the concealment. Camilla listened without challenging him. The queen consort understood that she would keep her public place, but matters involving Elizabeth's private legacy would remain beyond her control. No title, ceremony, or closeness to the throne could restore trust simply because the crisis was over. Charles closed the recovered file and told her the matter was finished. He did not raise his voice. That restraint made the verdict heavier. Camilla understood that the punishment was not banishment. It was a permanent boundary. She would remain beside him, but she would never again hold unquestioned influence over the private wishes Elizabeth had left behind. Charles also established a new safeguard inside the household. Future private instructions from a sovereign would follow a protected route, designed to prevent competing family interests from redirecting them after death. The king had learned the lesson at enormous personal cost, and William understood exactly what it meant. Protecting the monarchy sometimes required confronting the family within it. Elizabeth's wishes were finally restored. Charles emerged from the crisis wounded but certain. Camilla remained part of his life, but not with the same private trust. William saw the family survive without pretending the betrayal had never happened. There was nowhere else for the truth to hide. Elizabeth had been heard, Charles had delivered his judgment, and the monarchy closed the chapter carrying a scar it would remember, but no unfinished debt.